Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if different ways of hurting yourself mean different things for suicide risk, especially for autistic people? Well, this new study dives deep into that very question. This is a really important topic because sadly, self-harm and suicide are significant concerns for autistic individuals. Researchers wanted to understand if the way someone self-harms might tell us something different about their risk of suicidal thoughts and actions. Are certain self-harm behaviors more closely linked to suicide than others? And does this connection look different for autistic and non-autistic people? To tackle this, they gathered data from over 600 people, both autistic and non-autistic, who had experienced non-suicidal self-injury, or NSI. Think of NSI as self-harm that isn't intended to end your life. They used a cool technique called network analysis, which is like mapping out how different behaviors and thoughts are connected. It helps us see what things tend to happen together and how strongly they relate to each other. They first looked at how self-harming behaviors, suicidal thoughts, and related issues like depression were linked in separate groups of autistic and non-autistic people. Then they took it a step further by following a group of autistic participants for a full year to see if certain self-harm behaviors at the beginning predicted suicidal experiences later on. Let's break down how they did this. They collected information from 2 online surveys. For their first analysis, they looked at a solid number of participants diagnosed with autism and another group who were not autistic. They focused specifically on people who had engaged in self-harm. The researchers used this network analysis to create visual maps showing how various self-harm behaviors, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, depression, and feelings of being a burden or feeling alone were connected. They did this separately for the autistic group and the non-autistic group, trying to account for any age differences between them. Next, they zoomed in on a smaller group of autistic participants who had shared their experiences at 2 different times, about a year apart. This allowed them to explore if self-harm behaviors measured at the first time point could predict suicidal thoughts and feelings. At the second time point, they used a statistical method called LASSO regression, which is a smart way to figure out which factors are the most important predictors in a complex situation, especially when you have a lot of variables. So, what did they find? This is where the story really gets interesting. The network analysis showed some clear differences between autistic and non-autistic people in how self-harming behaviors cluster together and how they relate to suicidal thoughts and behaviors. For autistic individuals, they found 3 distinct clusters of self-harm behaviors. One cluster included things like scratching, self-biting, and hitting. Another involved self-burning, wound interference, and skin tearing. And a third, more closely connected to suicidal attempts, included behaviors like cutting and ingesting dangerous substances. In contrast, the non-autistic group showed more of a single unified community of self-harm behaviors. This suggests that when autistic people self-harm, the behaviors might be more varied and perhaps serve different purposes or are connected in different ways compared to non-autistic individuals. Interestingly, behaviors like cutting and ingesting harmful substances or sharp objects were consistently linked to suicide attempts in both groups. The researchers explained that these are behaviors that could more easily lead to serious harm or death, and over time might contribute to becoming desensitized to pain and the fear of dying, which is a known factor in suicide risk. Now, let's talk about what happened over the year of follow-up for the autistic participants. When they looked at how self-harm behaviors at the first time point predicted suicidal outcomes, a year later, some things became clearer. Initially, behaviors like cutting, self-biting, and fighting to get hurt seemed to be related to later suicidal experiences. However, after accounting for existing suicidal thoughts and feelings at the beginning, some of these links disappeared. But here is what remains significant. For autistic individuals, behaviors like self-biting were still strong predictors of suicidal thoughts a year later. Also, fighting to get hurt, which is a bit of an unusual behavior that doesn't directly involve self-inflicted injury, but rather getting hurt through fighting, was linked to feeling like a burden to others. This points to some complex connections beyond just direct self-harm. So, what does all of this mean? This study highlights that the way autistic people self-harm can be different from non-autistic people, and these differences matter in relation to suicidal risk. The clustering of behaviors in autistic individuals suggests that there might be different underlying reasons or functions for these different types of self-harm. For example, some might be more impulsive, while others might be more deliberate. Cutting and ingesting dangerous items appear to be more directly linked to suicide attempts across the board. likely because of their potential severity. The fact that some self-harm behaviors were predictive of later suicidal experiences, even after controlling for initial suicidal thoughts, is a crucial finding. It suggests that certain patterns of self-harm might play a role in the trajectory of suicidal ideation and distress over time, perhaps through complex pathways that we're only just beginning to understand. Now, it is important to acknowledge what this study can tell us. The researchers point out a few things. First, correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because one thing predicts another doesn't mean it directly causes it. While they looked at data over a year, longer-term longitudinal studies are needed to truly understand cause and effect. They also mentioned that some of the tools they use to measure self-harm haven't been specifically tested and validated for autistic adults. This means the interpretation of those measures might be slightly different for this group. A big limitation is that the autistic and non-autistic groups weren't perfectly matched. The autistic participants were generally older, and there were differences in the recency and extent of self-harm experiences. This makes it a bit harder to say for sure if the differences they saw are due to autism itself or these other factors. Also, the sample might not represent all autistic people, especially those with higher support needs. One of the biggest challenges for future research, as the authors note, is understanding the function of self-harm. Why do people do it? Different behaviors might serve different purposes, like emotional regulation, sensory seeking, or a way to cope with overwhelming stress. So, the big takeaway here is that the landscape of self-harm is complex, especially for autistic individuals. While all self-harm should be taken seriously, understanding that different behaviors might have different connections to suicidal risk is a critical step. This research suggests that therapies and support might need to be tailored not just to the presence of self-harm, but also to the specific ways it manifests and the underlying reason. It is a really important area of research, and this study adds valuable pieces to the puzzle. It helps us move towards a more nuanced understanding of self-harm and suicide risk in autistic populations, which can ultimately lead to better support and interventions. What are your thoughts on these findings? Do you think different methods of self-harm have different meanings? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.